Hello everyone and welcome. I am Jess Baker. In fact, nobody else is around to give me an intro, so I'll do my own. Our next speaker is a chartered psychologist and an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. She has extensive experience as a business consultant, senior HR manager, and as a women's leadership coach. She's often quoted in health and business magazines and speaks at national wellbeing events. She's personally experienced in the Imposter Syndrome at different points in her life. Today, she's going to give you an insight into the Imposter Syndrome and how to break this destructive cycle to help us enjoy the success we actually really deserve. Please give a warm welcome to Jess Baker. That's me. Thank you very much. Yes, those are all of my accolades, and I am owning them, okay? So, let's begin. So, do you know that we've been upgraded? We were supposed to be in a small room downstairs where all the other breakouts are happening. But because this is such a popular talk title, firstly, I'm kind of delighted about that. Secondly, kind of worried. What's going on? What's going on with us? But you're in the right place. Ooh. I want to give you an overview today of what the imposter syndrome is, talk about the causes and the negative impacts that are vast and varied, and go through quite a few different methods that are really useful in helping you combat the symptoms. And then I want to introduce to you a new approach, and it's something that I've been using myself and with clients for the past few years, so I'm quite excited to when we get to that part too. For now, let's do a brief experiment. Can you think to yourself of one thing you are very good at? Just think to yourself of one thing you are best at. Maybe it's something from your work, your hobbies, somewhere else in your life, a different aspect of your life. Maybe it's something you used to do but haven't done for ages. And when you've thought of that one thing, can you raise your hand in the air so I can see? Just raise your hand in the air when you've got one. Lovely. So that's a really good start. We can think of one thing that we are really good at and enjoy doing. Keep your hands raised, please, because in a moment I'm going to choose one of you to come up on stage and tell us why you're good at that one thing. Okay, I'm not actually going to do that. But I'm sure there are a couple of people in this room who would have gone, pick me, and fair enough. But did you know that most of us, over 70% of us, experience the imposter syndrome at any one point in our lives? And did you know that if you have experienced it once, you are likely to experience it again? So, I would like to invite you to come to this session with a curious mindset, an open mindset. I'm going to be showing you some tools, and we're going to be exploring the imposter syndrome, and not all of it will resonate with you directly, but it may be useful to people you know, women you work with, your friends, etc. So, actually, what I'd like to do next is read you a story. You can relax after that momentary fear you just experienced. And I'll just move to the front, see if my mic works still. Yes. Okay, I want to introduce you to Abby. Abby's actually based on a very good friend of mine. She makes cakes for friends and family and has done for years. I've changed her name, and she has allowed me to use these actual photos from her Facebook page. Abby has been making birthday cakes for friends and family for several years. It's the thing she is best at. She's been on cake-making courses, she's been practicing, she's really in her zone when she's decorating and making animal objects from icing sugar, and when she's making delicate leaves from icing sugar. She even really enjoys the planning element, the timetabling in advance. What am I going to need? How long is it going to take? How many times do I need to practice before I get it right? Each cake seems to get more elaborate. She likes to challenge herself. Her friends post pictures of themselves with the cakes on Facebook, like this one, and she sees the delight on their children's faces as they're blowing out the candles. The positive comments say how they look amazing. And they do. And they say, and her friends say, Abby, it's the most moist cake in the world. And we all know that is the highest accolade of a cake. It's moist. She secretly dreams of baking full time, and her husband is actually encouraging her to do so. One evening, Clara called. Clara is Abby's best friend. She was super successful and very wealthy. She was getting married in the autumn in an exclusive country house in Berkshire. It was going to be a lavish wedding of 120 guests, and they had exclusive access to the whole house for the whole weekend. Abby was very excited about going, but when Clara phoned, she said, I've got a huge favour to ask. Abby said, yes. I'd prefer you to make my cake than a professional baker I've never met before. Would you, Abby, make my cake for me? And Abby hesitated, of course. She hesitated, but she said, of course I will. I would love to. Clara said, I'll pay you professional rates, and let's talk about the details later. Perfect. But as soon as Abby put the phone down, the sensation of fear and dread smothered her like a heavy duvet. Why on earth had I said yes? I've never made a wedding cake before. It's going to be a huge white mess. Everyone will laugh. Clara will cry. I'll be humiliated. It's just going to be disaster. And Clara will never speak to me again. I can't possibly charge her for something that's going to be such an awful mess. I wish she hadn't even asked me. Looking through the photos of her own cakes on Facebook, Abby finds tiny faults in every single one of them. She notices imperfections in almost every one that no one else seemed to see. There was one nice one, but that was just down to luck. That just kind of happened at the last minute and all came together. Abby forgets the hours and hours she spent practicing in the kitchen until 2 a.m. every night. Each leaf had to be perfect. Each little animal had to be perfect. She discounts the positive comments people have left. They're just being nice. Of course they're saying that. It's Facebook. Everyone's nice on Facebook. She dismisses the delights on the children's faces. Oh, well, it's their birthday. Of course they're happy. But she has committed to baking the cake, and she won't back out. But she finds herself fretting at 4 a.m., night after night. She's having nightmares, and she can see the faces of disappointment on people's faces when they reveal the cake, and the bitter lemon smile when they taste it. Oh God, why did I say yes? Abby is experiencing the imposter syndrome, and I wonder how many of you here resonate with any of her experiences. We'll be coming back to Abby throughout the whole session, in case you're wondering why I was telling you such a long story. I think the good news, though, is that I will be focusing, and there are solutions, there are options, and we'll come to those throughout the session. Back in the 70s, a couple of women clinical therapists got together and had a chat and started talking honestly and openly about some of the themes that some of their women were bringing to the therapy session about self-doubt and not enjoying their successes. And Pauline Clance and Susan Ims then got together and said, we need to do more research. There's something going on here we need to know more about. From all of their research, which is mostly in the 70s with professors, academics, and students, they come up with a really wonderful, elaborate definition of what the imposter syndrome is. And part of that is intellectual self-doubt. But actually, in my experience, and in Abby's experience, and other people's experience, it's not always intellectual self-doubt. It can be about any of your abilities. So, based on the research, my own experience, and some of the women that I've coached, I've come up with this definition. An unhelpful reaction to a situation. You have doubts about whether you're the right person for the job. You feel anxious about failing. You feel exposed, underconfident, and like a fraud. Now, although it's called a syndrome, it's not actually a medical condition. But my understanding is that Pauline and Susan wanted to make it sound serious And it is. It actually has a lot of negative impacts that we'll look at later. Here's an example of somebody who has experienced the imposter syndrome. I'm sure you're all aware of who Sheryl Sandberg is. Here she says, every time I took a test, I was sure that it had gone badly. And every time I didn't embarrass myself, or even excelled, I believed that I had fooled everyone again. This is one example that I'll be drawing on. Now, as I said earlier, whilst not all of us have experienced the imposter syndrome, you probably know or work with people who have, or people who are. Some people experience it at every level of their career. The research shows that there are 3 things that keep the imposter syndrome alive and well. And I've called these 3 insatiable needs. And you might recognize some of this in yourself or people that you know. For example, perfection. I want to do a great job. Most of us want to do a great job. But if you're experiencing the imposter syndrome, it has to be perfect. Everything has to be perfect. As you and I know, there is actually nothing perfect in this world. Maybe holiday brochures and the digitally enhanced women who advertised skincare in magazines. Perfect. But in the real world, that doesn't really exist. If you have the imposter syndrome, you set unrealistic expectations. You pride yourself on having really high standards, and you might even compete with it. I've got such high standards, I'm just so busy, I've got such high standards, like nothing else will do. Whereas other people are working maybe, to the 80-20 rule, 80% is good enough. And when you are a perfectionist, you are also moving the goalposts. So even if you reach a high standard, you move the goalposts. That wasn't quite good. Well, if I could do that, maybe I could just do this. And you're pushing yourself further and further into this perfectionistic state that is completely insatiable. Abby, for example, spotted faults in every single cake. No cake she ever made would ever be good enough in her eyes. She has unrealistic expectations and she cannot win. How about social comparison? A normal person would say, a person not experiencing, most people would say, I want to know what the benchmark of success is. And I think that's fair enough. If you're going through a performance review, you want to know, like versus like, how am I comparing to my team who are doing a very similar job? You don't want to know how you are doing compared to the CEO. But that's what happens for the people with the imposter syndrome. One of my clients recently was comparing herself, it seems, to someone who was in her industry, but 10 years her senior, with 10 years more experience, which is why she had 3 more books under her belt and had a higher media profile. But how unfair. She was, inevitably going to experience feeling like rubbish the whole time. And let's take Abby from the example earlier. She's comparing herself to perhaps a cake that a professional baker would make. The cake she has in her own mind is probably like 4 or 5 tiers tall, one of those beautiful, huge wedding cakes with roses and petals and pearls falling on the outside. And she's thinking, I can't possibly make that. She's comparing herself to something someone else with much more experience would be able to do. And we get caught up in the cycle if we're not careful. But social comparison, even for most of us, is unhealthy. When you are comparing yourself to others, you're comparing yourself unfavorably. You rarely say, how do I compare to that person? Oh my God, I'm amazing. Does anyone in here have a voice in their head saying, oh my God, I'm amazing? No. By the end of the session, you will, it's fine. Okay. And let's take external validation. I want feedback. I want constructive criticism. Most of us would say that. Most of us desire that. But for somebody with the imposter syndrome, discounting the feedback is the first thing. So no matter how great your feedback is, you'll discount it. You'll be like, oh yeah, thanks anyway. They obviously haven't found out yet that I'm an imposter and I'm not actually capable of doing this job. You'll discount it, you'll say, well, they're not really a good judge, are they? They don't really know what I do. They're not a very good judge of that, so that's fine. You could put it down to just being nice. Or you could say, well, that was luck, actually. That thing that you're praising me for, yeah, that just kind of happened, as if by magic. And for Amy, every single person loves her cakes. They rave about them. There are positive comments everywhere on Facebook, etc. But she discounts the praise, like I was telling you in the story. She can't win. So the sum here really is that if you're experiencing the imposter syndrome, nothing you do is ever good enough in your own eyes. And you find yourself on a never-ending cycle like this one. So, in brief, what you have here is success. Ta-da! Congratulations, you have just started a new job. Fantastic, well done. Most people would be delighted. No, not you. You're like, oh no, they're going to find out who I am. They hired me by mistake. Maybe I was the last candidate on the list and everyone said no, they were too busy. I'm going to mess up. I'm lucky to be here, really. So then you get this fear settling in, which leads you to striving, because suddenly you feel like you have to prove yourself. Well, if I'm so rubbish as I think I am, I'm going to have to prove myself because they've set me up to succeed here. They're expecting really high things of me. And so you strive, you stay late, you work harder, you have no personal life, you give your life, your soul, your blood. And for what? A promotion. Yes. Most people's dreams, but not if you've got the imposter syndrome. No, don't pick me. Leave me alone. So you get more responsibility. The success cycle, this imposter cycle starts again. Success, but I'm afraid I've never done this before. How do I become? I've never been CEO before. How do you do that? So, as you can see, there's a cycle, and it's really difficult to break. It really is. But if you stay on this cycle and you don't do anything, it can lead to burnout. And if you haven't experienced burnout yourself, you probably know someone who has. A really great example of striving is Lupita Nyong'o. She says, I go through acute imposter syndrome with every role. I think winning an Oscar, she says, I think winning an Oscar may have in fact made it worse. Now I've achieved this, what am I going to do next? What do I strive for now? That honestly breaks my heart. Because if she's walking around thinking that, what hope is there for her? To enjoy her success, to feel entitled, to deserve it. So let's go for a quick overview of the things that we've discussed so far. You can't really enjoy your success because you're afraid that you're not good enough and you're afraid of being found out. You compare yourself unfavorably to others, so you strive to prove yourself. You discount praise even when it comes thick and fast, and then inevitably you end up succeeding because you're working harder than anyone else in your department. So the question is, what happens if we don't change anything? It's not a useful place to be. The imposter syndrome is really unhelpful. And I'm going to depress you even more just before we get onto the nice little high out of this, okay? But I want to lay it all out there because, like I've said, even if you haven't experienced imposter syndrome, some of these symptoms will be familiar with you. And if not you, then your colleagues. We've got 3 different types of negative impact here, and they are interlinked, but I've tried to put them into separate buckets. We've got emotional, physical, and behavioural. Emotionally, you're feeling underconfident. Now, to be honest with you, confidence is transient. So it's never going to be something that, I'm going to become a confident woman, and I'm going to feel confident in every situation all of the time. No. So we all experience underconfidence, and that's normal. But as you start on the slippery slope with the imposter syndrome, it then leads to not enjoying your success, feeling dissatisfied at work, experiencing low self-esteem, and that's when the self-doubt starts creeping in. Am I really good enough? You start questioning your decisions. You might even delay making decisions because you're not sure it's the right one to make. You feel anxious. Ultimately, you might even feel depressed. Physically, as some of you may have experienced in my little experiment earlier, your heart rate might have started to increase. A mild sense of panic, like, please don't look at me. And inevitably you feel tension, whether you hold tension in your neck or your shoulders, your back or your tummy. Our bodies end up manifesting aches and pains. Increased blood pressure, loss of sleep, worrying, ruminating. Have you ever ruminated where you find yourself, maybe at 4 a.m. in the morning, maybe that's just something that happens to me, where you're going through arguments and you're thinking, oh, if only I'd said that. If only I'd said this, it would have been the best thing. But we spend a lot of time worrying about the past and fretting about the future, anticipating things to go perhaps a little worse than they would be. But worst case scenario, we start worst case scenarioing and catastrophizing. So it's easy to get caught up in this loss of sleep. And eventually, if you are experiencing stress, then you know it can manifest itself in your body and exacerbate other illnesses like diabetes and obesity. Behaviorally, you might start procrastinating. Anyone here ever procrastinated? Just go, if you've ever procrastinated. Yeah, I'm queen of procrastinating. I actually used to tell myself, if I allow myself 3 days to procrastinate, that's fine. And then I can get on with the job. And of course, 3 days will turn into 3 weeks and nothing would happen and the fear just grows. But that's what happens. That's a sign that we're not ready. We want to avoid something. We want to kind of say, if we just leave that, it will go away. It will. Maybe you want to avoid trigger situations. If it's talking in meetings, if it's doing a presentation, if it's George and you see him in the corridor and you quickly nip into the ladies and hide for 5 minutes, you avoid certain situations rather than facing them confidently. You begin to undervalue your achievements and yourself. You're not putting yourself forward. You're not raising your own profile at work. You're scared and you want to stay safe. You want to protect yourself, and that's quite normal, really. But this can also inhibit your performance. If you're feeling the fear, how well are you going to be able to focus on the task in hand? How productive are you going to be, really, if you've got something hanging over your head? Inevitably, this can all lead to career underachievement, and then you're stuck because you have so much to offer, and yet this thing has got in your way. And let's explore this thing in a moment. I was talking about self-doubt, and I think here's a really good example of that. This is Jennifer Lee. Have you watched the film Frozen? It's amazing, I love it. She's the award-winning director. And she says here, if I've learned one thing, it's that self-doubt is one of the most destructive forces. It makes you defensive instead of open. It makes you reactive instead of active. Self-doubt is consuming and cruel. And we bring it on ourselves. But anyway, the turning point. Yes, we've talked about the imposter syndrome. We know it's a horrible thing, it's unhelpful. We've talked about various causes and lots of different negative impacts. But what can we do to combat it? It's actually a serious problem. And it's not only going to affect you on an individual level, it can affect your team, your function, your organization. So I think as well there is a broader question here about how we can kind of own up to how we feel as human beings, as emotional human beings at work. And part of that is getting to understand how we think and feel about ourselves. That's for me where it really starts. But let's look at some of the symptoms, because it's not going away that easily. So, have you all heard of Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway? It's a book by Susan Jeffers back in the 80s. And she said that fear is actually a green light. She said if you're feeling fear, it's a sign that you're growing. So suck it up, accept it, carry on regardless. And I quite like that, but it doesn't always work. Rewrite your CV. This is a classic one. And if you haven't written your CV in a while, I strongly recommend you do so. It's really useful, a reminder of all of the experience you've got, all of the things you've ever achieved, the programs that you might have worked on 10 or 20 years ago that you've just buried and forgotten. Write it out. List every single thing, because that's a really good way of boosting this internal validation. You know, earlier I said we're looking for external validation and approval the whole time. Writing your CV can help you boost your internal validation, where you feel like, I'm owning this. I'm owning my achievements and I'm owning my success. I don't need other people's approval. And with personal strengths, I like this one. The positive psychology founder called Professor Martin Seligman, some of you may have come across his books on happiness or flourishing. Positive psychology came about because psychology was focusing on mental illness and what's wrong with the human mind. And positive psychology is really focusing on what can we do better? How can we increase our own sense of well-being? How can we enjoy life more? So here, this is about, one of the aspects of positive psychology is looking at your strengths, things that you are innately good at. And I'm not talking about being good at an Excel spreadsheet, but actually really hating every second of it just because you can do a pivot table. I'm talking about something that you really are good at, something that you really enjoy doing. I'll explain more about that in a second, but if you turn to your handout, hopefully you've all got a handout. If you turn to the second page, part 2, you'll see it says, in pairs, discuss notes. So first of all, list 3 of your strengths. And if you can only think of 1 or 2, that's absolutely fine. There's no pressure here. And I'm not actually going to ask anyone to do anything again. You'll just be working in pairs for this. So just list 3 of your strengths, things that you are good at, things that you enjoy doing. And you might find it difficult. In which case, maybe have a quick conversation, ask each other, what is the one thing that you enjoy doing? If you could spend, half a day or a whole day or a whole week working on this, what would it be? And then in pairs, if you just don't mind pairing up with each other, the person you're sitting next to, just ask each other, how are you currently drawing on this strength at the moment in any aspect of your life? Okay, hopefully you've all got pens, and I'll just time you 5 minutes for this. Okay, great. If you can wind up your conversations. So, shall we move on? We've got quite a lot to cover still, but I'm glad that seemed to set you all off, and you had plenty to talk about, which is fantastic. So I'm really glad. And, come back to this exercise. Do it again. Do it with your friends. Do it with your family. It's really nice and actually really simple. But again, it's about boosting your own internal validity, your own self-confidence. And it's really good at not having to rely on other people for that. On meditation and relaxation, can I ask if any of you have tried to meditate before? Quite a few. Anyone? Keep your hand up in the air if you found it really easy. Yeah, impossible. What happens when you sit still for 5 minutes and just breathe? Like the Rolodex of your brain carries on and starts searching for things, random things, and digs up things from the past. You thought, what? Why am I thinking of them? Yes, that's normal. Your brain likes to go off on tangents. It's very difficult, but there's lots of research to suggest that meditating for a regular, even just 20 minutes a day, can help you rewire your brain to help you reduce the level of anxiety and fear that you have at the moment. And focusing, kind of giving yourself time. We all talk about self-care at the moment. And sometimes for some people that's like a bubble bath or a chocolate cake. But actually, whatever it is that helps you relax and rejuvenate and re-energize can't be a bad thing. And I think it's so easy for us to keep our heads in our phones and constantly answering emails and questions, and we forget to make any time for ourselves. So my challenge for you is to think of one thing that you can do this week that you haven't done in a while, whether that is a bubble bath, whether that is taking a walk, something that you really love to do that re-energizes you. Do that one thing this week, just for yourself. The attitude of gratitude. I love this one. One of the principles of Buddhism is gratitude. And the Dalai Lama has been quoted saying, gratitude is the key to happiness. Positive psychology also draws on gratitude as a way of enhancing how you feel, your satisfaction about what you've got already. Earlier we were talking about striving for more, for better, for whatever it might be, but we haven't quite reached the standards. Whereas gratitude is saying, what have I got right now? And is that good enough right now, in this moment? Because that's all life's made up of, right? This moment and this moment. So I have another task for you on section 3 of your handout, and hopefully you've all got one now. They are making some more copies. We seem to have more women in the room than we expected, so sorry about that. Turn to part 3 on your handout, and you'll see that it just says, list the things you are grateful for. Now, is anyone else competitive in this room? Because I'm going to time you 1 minute, and I'm going to ask you to list as many things as you possibly can in that 1 minute, and there are even psychedelic stress balls to be won, okay? So, obviously the best breakout session, we have prizes. So, is that clear enough? Please can you start now by listing all of the things you're grateful for. It could be huge things like the love of my life, or teeny things like the tube was on time. Yay. Go for it. And do the countdown thing. Okay, and stop. So please raise your hands if you've got over 5, over 10, over 15. Oh, 2 hands, a few hands at the front. Over 20. Couple, ooh, 1 person, no 2. Is that right? 3. Oh, pick me. No, I'm just saying. And it's true, I can't see you, so thank you for raising your hand. So how many did you get? 20. 20? Ooh. And anyone else over here? We have a clear winner with 2 runners-up. Woohoo! Come and collect your psychedelic stress balls later on afterwards. Yay! I do like a game. I'm really immature. Sorry about that. But hopefully you found that, if not easy, then challenging. And just a very small reminder of how we can be more grateful for the very small things in life, you know? And be more in this moment and remind ourselves what we have got rather than all the time what we haven't. You know, we're constantly bombarded with adverts, you know, what you should have, how your lifestyle should be, etc., etc. And it's that thing of gratitude that we were talking earlier about striving on the imposter cycle, you know, and it's really about how can we stop striving? Why are we striving? And trying to fill that gap. Okay. Have you heard of mindful self-compassion? Anybody? To be honest, when I first heard about it, I thought it sounded really cheesy. And I was like, I don't need that. That sounds like navel-gazing. And it sounds a bit, I don't know, soft. But I learned that it isn't an option. Self-compassion is actually essential. There is my favourite professor, Kristin Neff. She talks about self-compassion, and she describes it as a way of, by examples. And my example today is, if a friend phones you up and she's bitterly upset and emotional, and she is just bawling her eyes out, and she phones you, what are you going to say? You're going to listen to her. You're going to validate how she's feeling. You're going to say, Susie, it's fine. Of course you feel like this. Anyone else in the situation would feel a bit rubbish as well, feel really upset. But it's going to be okay. You would soothe her. You would reassure her. You would be all out nice and lovely and the friend that she really needs right now. But what if you were feeling like that? What if you're feeling upset about something? Do you try and push it aside? Do you say, oh, God, just get over it. Why am I still thinking about that thing? Get over it. There are more important things in life. Come on. And you start berating yourself for experiencing what we all experience as the human condition. And with all the negative stuff we have in our own heads, which we'll come to shortly, we have to actively work to be nice to ourselves, to be kind and to be reassuring and to soothe ourselves. Also, being compassionate is kind of getting away from social comparison in a way. Because one element of self-compassion is not just to be kind, but it's also to accept how you are right now, as a human, how you are. And if you can accept how you are, rather than constantly trying to change it or prove yourself will be better, etc., then you're more likely to not look to others for approval or for comparison. You're boosting your own internal validation, boosting your own self-confidence in this way. The final one on this slide is seeking support. In fact, Clance and Eames, the researchers I mentioned earlier, they set up a support group for their colleagues so that they can sit around and chat over a coffee or a glass of wine and just express how they're feeling. Saying, I'm feeling really vulnerable in this new role, or I'm feeling a bit afraid, and I'm feeling a bit like, I'm not sure how I can do this, or if I'm going to get through this time. And then we'd coach each other. And I strongly recommend that if you can open the door to talking about the imposter syndrome or your emotions in a safe way, whether at work or with your friends or with your colleagues, it's really going to help you take the lid off, kind of reduce the amount of shame. That's it. It's reducing the amount of shame. Because if you're feeling afraid, you don't tell anyone. If you're feeling like an imposter at the table, you're not going to say, oh, excuse me, I feel like a bit of a fraud, I'm going to leave now. No, you sit there and you suffer silently. So, seek support. And it might be in the, seek support from friends, colleagues, or a coach or a therapist, whatever you feel you might need that's supportive. But it's hard because, and why I say seek external support is because often we just end up arguing with ourselves. I'm like, yes, you did. No, we didn't. Like panto, Okay. So we've looked at lots of different evidence-based methods that we can use to treat the symptoms. What I would like to do now is look at the very knob, what I think is the very knob of the imposter syndrome. We're going to look at the cause. And when we're doing this, I need you to ask yourself what's causing you to think and feel the way you think and feel at the moment. Because you need to understand one thing. The imposter syndrome, it's all in your head. Obviously, I'm a psychologist, I would say that, right? But it's true, trust me. We challenge other people's attitudes and behaviors and motives the whole time. We criticize, we judge, For example, let's take Abby. She thinks she's feeling terrible because she's been asked to make a wedding cake. But she's not. Abby's actually feeling terrible because she believes she's going to mess up in some way. So we create our own reality. And unless you are prepared to challenge your perspective, which I really hope you are today, because we're going to do an exercise in a minute, then nothing is going to change. Perception is everything. So you might have seen this before. It's the Muller-Lyer illusion. And you can see the two vertical lines, and I would ask you, which one looks longest? And you'll say, the one on the left, because it does look longest. It does look longer than the one on the right. But it's not. They're exactly the same size. Just because it looks longer doesn't make it longer. And again, this is all about judging our perception. We have to be able to change the way we see things if we're going to break the imposter cycle, if we're going to step off this self-berating, self-loathing cycle. And how do we change that, I hear you ask, Jess? Well, you have to change the way you think about yourself. So let's look at the ABC process, some of you might be familiar with. This comes from cognitive behavioral therapy and has been widely used for decades during therapy and during coaching. And I'm mentioning it today because it's really useful for anyone and everyone. I don't think we should have to wait for things to get so bad that we end up having to see a coach or a counsellor or a therapist. I think we can actually start helping ourselves. So the ABC, the activation, is a situation, the belief, the thoughts you're having about that situation, and the consequence, how you are feeling as a consequence. So using Abby's example again, the situation is that she's been asked to make a wedding cake. Her belief that she's going to make a really bad wedding cake, a big white mess. Consequence, she feels anxious. She feels highly strung. She's tense. She's afraid she's going to mess up and it's going to be a complete disaster. So identifying your beliefs will help you to dispute them, and that's what we're going to be trying in a moment. Disputation is one aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy, where you identify the belief you have in order to change your behavior, in order to change your attitude as well. So, but before we do that, can I just briefly introduce you to what I call the inner critic? The inner critic resides inside your head. It's not a voice, it's a series of thoughts you have. Largely it resides in the unconscious mind, so you might not know that you have it or that you've ever tuned into it before. But it essentially says things like, I ought, I must, I should. Most people relate to that kind of conversation in their own head. I should go to the gym. I ought to have lost 5 pounds by this big occasion. I ought to be earning more money. I should be why are they living in a big house? I ought to be living in a bigger house. Or whatever it is that you strive for. You're berating yourself in some way. But your inner critic is unhelpful. And your inner critic is often based on something someone else once said to you, about you, or in front of you. And it may even have stemmed from something that was said in your childhood, from your parents, teachers, a bully in the playground, an ex-lover, hopefully an ex-lover. They're criticizing you. But your brain latched onto that message as if it were true, and because it's in your own head, you believe it. You don't question it as readily as you question other people. So let's use Abby's example. I'm aware that not all of you have the pocket guide in front of you. We did have 450 made, but so if you are sitting next to anyone that's got one, please can you share? But if not, don't worry, it's not a huge loss. Perhaps you can email me and I can post them to you or something at a later date. But I'm going to read this through, and I will read everything that's on here, so don't worry, you're not going to miss out. But on the other page of your handout, you will see some vowels, and there is an opportunity for you to write any notes as I'm going along. So we're just talking about disputing the inner critic at the moment. So in this pocket guide, I'm going to talk you through the 5 different sections, and it's a kind of flowing process. So we've got openness. In fact, what I'll do is recap the activation, belief, and consequence. You remember the ABC process? Our thoughts and beliefs, the B part, are about the things that happen to us, A. They determine how we feel and how we react. These thoughts are often negative, irrational, and unconscious. Disputation, disputing them, arguing with them, helps to make them conscious so we can challenge them with more logical thinking. So the first is openness. And this is really, actually this stage is missed off the traditional disputation method. It's something that I've added myself, because you have to be open to getting to know what's really going on in your head. What's that horrible thought you're having? What's that horrible self-limiting belief that's really stopping you from moving forward? And only you will know. I want to say it's really difficult to do this first time. So I'm going to use Abby's experience to show you how to do it. And I'll leave you with the guide as well to use in your own time. But don't be disheartened if it takes practice. And it might even be better if you have someone asking you these questions yourself, because otherwise you can get caught up in the whole kind of arguing, yes it is, no it isn't, Pento-style-y. Okay, so after openness we have evidence. Now that you know what your belief is, provide evidence to substantiate it. Then we're going to look at alternatives. Well, instead of thinking, Abby, we'll come to her in a second, the worst thing's going to happen, you could be thinking, actually, maybe there's an opportunity here. And for implications, well, we're going to be thinking, if the worst happened, what's the implication of that? If my belief actually came true, what's the worst that would happen? And then with usefulness, we're thinking, we're trying to identify how useful is it to hold this negative belief. So, I'm going to be talking through Abby's example and some of the questions that are on the pocket guide for those of you who can't see it. For those of you who can, if you want to follow along, feel free. Openness. I'll ask Abby, what self-critical thoughts are you having? In all honesty, Abby won't really know what thoughts she's having. She'll just be like, I don't know, but I feel terrible, I feel nervous, I feel afraid. So it'll probably take quite a while to coach her into identifying exactly what's going on in her head. But essentially, she's going to say something like, I'm going to make a terrible cake. And if I ask her, what beliefs underlie your negative feelings? Nothing I do is ever good enough. And if I ask, what deeper insecurities is this situation triggering in you? She's actually not going to have an idea at all. So after another hour of coaching, we might be able to get to the very nub of this. And it might transpire that she says that I am not good enough. And you might need to revisit and redefine this section in the openness. Really understand what is it that's holding you back? What is it that's getting in your way? What thought? Where is it from? And it's not a nice thing to do. It's not a nice thing to do, to tune into your inner critic. But it's essential, I think. When it comes to evidence, I'll ask Abby, what evidence is there to support these negative thoughts that you're going to make a terrible cake? Well, there's actually very little evidence, Jess, she'll say. There's no evidence that I'm going to make a terrible cake, because all the cakes I've made in the past have been absolutely fine. So what has happened in similar situations in the past? Well, like I just said, all the other cakes I made were fine. Everyone else seemed to like them. So there's not much evidence here, is there? No. What evidence is there for the opposite view? Well, the opposite view is I'm going to make an amazing cake and Clara will love it. Is there any evidence that you're going to make an amazing cake, Abby? Yes, actually, there's some evidence, because I'm going to put the hours in, I'm going to practice. I'm in my zone when I'm baking, I love it. Can't wait to get creative. So suddenly we're able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Alternatives. Abby, how else could you view the situation? And again, it's taken a long time with some clients to really get to see alternatives, because when you're so, and you might have experienced this yourself, I have, when you're so inside your own head and you're feeling the fear and you're terrified and you're worried, you don't want to humiliate yourself, it is really difficult to break out of that mindset. So again, that's why we get someone, if you can, get someone else to ask you these questions. And it might take a while, but you'll get there. What's an alternative view of this situation? Instead of saying, I'm going to make a terrible cake, Abby could actually say, it's an honor to be asked. She's not trying to trick me or trip me up in any way. How delightful. She's obviously a really good friend and she wants me to do really well. What would a more self-confident person think about this? They would probably showcase it. They'd be looking forward to practicing. They might even go on a couple of cake baking courses. They'd be looking forward to getting really creative. And what would a more positive explanation for this situation be? That Clara actually loves my cakes, and she wants me and she trusts me to do a really good job. The implications then lead into, even if your beliefs are true, how bad would it really be? So even if her belief that she's going to make a terrible cake is really true, how bad would it really be? Worst case scenario, Clara would be upset, maybe she'd cry, probably not over a wedding cake, she'd make a joke out of it, but she'd probably still be my friend. And also, I would remind Abby that even if she does make a terrible cake, that doesn't make her a terrible person. And that doesn't reflect all of her effort. And doesn't mean she's never made a terrible cake. It doesn't mean she won't ever make any really good cakes in the future. Are you focusing, Abby, on the worst imaginable outcome? Yes. I'm having nightmares. Having nightmares about the faces of disappointment. What would be a more realistic view of how this might turn out? well, actually, Clara will probably really enjoy it, and it could be really fun. And I get to showcase my wedding cake, and I get paid for it too, and I get some photos for my new website, because I'm going to start a business. Usefulness. How helpful is it to hold these beliefs of I'm going to make a terrible cake? Not at all. It's not at all helpful. What are the consequences of you continuing to think in this way? Well, if I continue to think that I'm going to make a terrible cake and I'm feeling the fear, then I'm not going to enjoy the next few months. I'll probably start procrastinating, I'll probably have sleepless nights, break out in sweats, and have headaches or something like that. So what would be the benefit of adopting a more positive view? Actually, I could really enjoy the next few months. I could feel grateful for this opportunity. Instead of spending the next few months worrying and fretting, I could really get into baking and challenge myself and become more creative. And I know this is all quite detailed, but I think it's really important really to understand that the one thing Abby is trying to avoiding, like being humiliated, feeling terrified, being embarrassed, what she's already feeling right now is equivalent to that. She's already feeling terrible. She's already feeling really, she's feeling the fear. So it's almost as if, what's the worst that can happen? Nothing, you're already feeling it. So that's disputation in 6 minutes. You've got the pocket guide, take it with you. Any questions, let me know. I want to ask you to do one thing. And back to self-kindness, really, back to self-compassion and Kristen Neff. You see this little kitty? It's a cute little kitty. Unless you're allergic, of course, and you're like, ew. But if this little kitten turned up at your back door, you would pick it up, you would nurture it, you would feed it, you would stroke it, you would soothe it, you would reassure it. So coming back to self-compassion, I just want you to say this in your head. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the compassion I need. And now can I ask you to say that with me? May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the compassion I need. Thank you. So to recap, most of us experience the imposter syndrome at some point. We have doubts about whether we're the right person for the job and feel anxious about failing. Ultimately, it's caused by how we think and feel about ourselves. And I've introduced you to the inner critic. There are some useful ways to reduce the impact of the symptoms, we've talked about those, and powerful ways to train our mind, to retrain our mind to think differently, to reduce the impact of that, to reduce the likelihood of experiencing it again. But ultimately, I want you to remember, if anything from this session, that you deserve to have higher self-worth. You deserve to have higher self-worth instead of self-doubt. You deserve to feel entitled to your successes. If you can do this, then you'll become a better role model for your friends and your colleagues and the women coming up the ladder behind you. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.